Hey, good evening. I'm Alex Talk, the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And the Thompson Center, really delighted to be able to bring you tonight's event. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you to everybody who's been part of putting this event together, especially Ruth and Lily at the Thompsons. Let me briefly explain what the Thompson Center is, for those of you who may not be familiar. Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by fostering effective public leadership and informing current and future leaders through public events such as this one, research and speaker grants, and other activities across the UW system. Is it possible to create a truly diverse and equitable campus without focusing on race? Can we find racial justice on campus without race as a central factor in how individuals are perceived? Or if so, how? These are important questions. Questions surrounding race, diversity, and affirmative action have become polarizing and fraught topics in contemporary society. I think it's fair to say that a certain orthodoxy on these subjects has evolved on campus. Affirmative action and other race-conscious policies are taken as necessary with little to no discussion or debate. This is striking, given that, depending on how you phrase the question, many as 3/4 of the country and half of Black Americans disagree. To me, the troubling part of all of this is not the difference of opinion between campus orthodoxy and many in the public, but the degree to which other views are dismissed out of hand as unworthy of even discussing, at best ill-informed and at worst racist. Last week, UW-Madison held its annual diversity forum, which has included past keynote speakers such as Robin DiAngelo. We proposed this event with us covering the costs as part of the diversity forum. They wanted nothing to do with it. We originally proposed this event not to promote any particular view, but because we think offering a variety of perspectives leads to a more fruitful discussion. And I hope tonight's event can do exactly that. At the same time, it gives us a chance to bring to campus one of the most thoughtful and prominent young intellectuals today. Our guest tonight is Coleman Hughes. Coleman is an author, podcaster, and opinion columnist who specializes in issues relating to race, public policy, and applied ethics. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other prominent outlets. Named to Forbes' 30 Under 30 list, Hughes has testified before the U.S. House Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, Civil Liberties. His first book, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America, was released earlier this year and made quite a splash. His media appearances have included The View, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, PBS's The Firing Line, and the Joe Rogan Experience. He's a columnist at the Free Press, a contributor at CNN. He also hosts a wonderful podcast, Conversations with Coleman, I would highly recommend to all of you. Indeed, I'm a little bit intimidated moderating a discussion with him, given how skilled of a moderator podcast. I also found out right before this event, this was first time in Wisconsin. So please give a warm welcome to Coleman Hughes.
Thanks for having me.
So just to start, use the term colorblind in your book and title for this event. Can you explain what you do and what you don't mean by a colorblind approach?
Yes. When I say colorblind, I don't mean pretend that you don't notice race, because this is the most common counter argument I hear and I heard when I started researching the book is just, what are you talking about? Why are you You're not colorblind. Don't be naive. We all see you. And so I wanted to make this extremely clear, and I put it right at the beginning of my book. Everyone sees race, at least everyone in America that grows up the conscious culture that we have. You notice that I'm not Asian woman. I notice that you are not Indian man. And so, and more than that, race can influence how we treat people and how we get treated. So racial bias is a real phenomenon. What I mean by colorblind is that despite all of that, we should try our best to treat people without regard to race, which is to say, I'm not going to treat you any differently because of the race I assume you belong to. And I'm going to ask you to extend the same principle to me. And we're going to join hands and both ask the state, the government, not treat us any differently because of our race. And wherever the state needs to categorize in order to help folks, do that on the basis of socioeconomic indicators, on the basis of other non-racial proxies, on the basis of class, if it makes sense. That's what I mean by colorblindness. And that's what the civil rights movement was about, despite the efforts to rewrite the history of that movement. And that's what I wrote my book to defend.
So you were an undergrad not too long ago, a lot less long ago than I was. What role did your time at Columbia play in sparking your interest in writing about race and identity politics?
So I should pull it back a little bit before I got to Columbia. I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, just outside New York. It's a multiracial town, a very diverse town, a very liberal town. And the kind of liberal it was Martin Luther King liberalism, was implicit, taken for granted that you treat people as individuals. Your skin color doesn't matter. What matters is who you are on the inside. We all bleed red. What are your values? That's it. That was the prevailing ethos. That's what I grew up with. When I got to Columbia, I was suddenly dropped in a very strange subculture where during orientation week, we did an exercise where we were asked to go to a different corner of the room based on our race, which already I felt violated the implied norm that I had grown up with. Right? It's literally the opposite. We venerate the fight against segregation, and now we're being asked to segregate, self-segregate, to backwards. And we did all these exercises. We were made to talk about how we either participated in or victimized by systemic racism, which again is a term I think most people didn't grow up with. And whatever the intention of this, the overall effect was to actually make me feel more alienated from my fellow students during orientation week, because I wanted them to come up and shake my hand and say, hey, what's your name? What are you about? Then I would tell them what I'm about, and I would learn what they're about. And that's how you make friends. That's how you make best friends, your husband, with your wife, based on your traits. Because of these exercises, I now fear that they were being taught to see me as a victimized Black guy, victim of racism, which is the furthest thing from my personal life experience growing up upper middle class in Montclair. And so the overall effect of this was to achieve the exact opposite: increase racial tensions, increase racial paranoia, increase racial anxiety in an exercise allegedly designed to do the opposite of all of those things. And so Columbia was a shock to me. It was almost a culture shock to me, coming from a liberal American town 10 miles away, because every week I was reading the campus newspaper about how there was white supremacy all over campus. And every week I was a Black kid on campus looking for this white supremacy to rear its head. And the gap between rhetoric and reality, that became interesting to me, because I was never interested in race. prior. I cared about music and philosophy and other things 18-year-old boys care about that we don't have to talk about. But that gap became interesting, and that's when I started writing about it.
So, Civil Rights Act was passed almost exactly 60 years ago. Some racial groups will remain underrepresented on campus and elsewhere in society. How do you respond to the argument that colorblind policies just haven't worked? They haven't sufficiently addressed the racial disparities, and so we need race-conscious policies just until equality is achieved, then we can switch to a colorblind approach.
To say that we need race-conscious policies until equality of outcome is achieved is the same as saying we need race-conscious policies forever. Because no society in history, nor any society in the future, will ever achieve this fantasy that is held up of so-called equality of outcome. One way of looking at this, I mean, there's a million ways of looking at it, but one way of looking at this is to just take race out of the equation, just talk about ethnic groups. Talk about white ethnic groups. After 250 years, America has not even come close to achieving equality of outcome between different kinds of white people. Okay, go on Wikipedia and look up household income by ethnic group. You will find the Irish have still very different incomes than Russian Americans and French Americans. They have the kinds of gaps that would be, the kinds of gaps on the order of the wage gap between men and women, between different white ethnic groups, that no one really alleges there is serious discrimination along those lines anymore. So my point here is not to say racism doesn't exist. There is racism, but even in a perfectly racism-free society, you should not expect to see perfect equality of outcome across the board, given a multicultural society, right? What does it mean to have a multicultural society, really? What it means is that you've got different cultures in the same society, right? If you have different cultures, and if you believe culture matters, which I do, then it follows that differences between cultures matter, right? And so you can't have different cultures all perform the same identically, specialize in the same thing. Kids don't grow up wanting to be the same thing necessarily. Okay? Certain kids grow up and some cultures emphasize certain kinds of jobs and sectors. Other cultures emphasize other values, right? So even in the racism-free world, we're never going to get to equality of outcome, and that's not really the proper goal. Now, that said, I still think we can make progress toward that end without violating the principle of colorblindness. So in my book, in the last chapter of my book, I talk about Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist who did great research in the Houston public school system. They basically gave him the keys to like 12 public schools, which never happens. He had no barriers. There's a teachers' unions. He could basically do whatever he wanted. And he did an amazing experiment where he basically fired half the teachers and replaced them with better people, fired all the principals, extended the school day, implemented a more rigorous curriculum, and he brought up math and reading scores at the lowest performing schools in Houston by like a standard deviation, which is almost unheard of in social science research. So if you do something like that on the basis of class rather than race, you're going to end up helping disproportionately poor Black and Hispanic kids. And you're going to end up shrinking some of the outcome gaps that bother all Americans of good conscience. But you'll have made progress toward that goal, understanding that the closing gaps is not achievable or even desirable in multicultural systems. But we can still make progress toward that without really racially discriminating.
Yeah, so I think related to this, What do you think of the claim that affirmative action is needed not to create equality of outcomes, but just to level the playing field, equal opportunity?
Yeah, well, I don't buy it. It's a very Orwellian claim that we're going to level the playing field by making the playing field unlevel, right? You know, is war is peace, and everything's backwards, everything's upside down. When you have, as we know has happened, Asian kids in Queens actually manipulating their resumes so that the college admission officers don't think Asian, right? This is confirmed. There's so many cases of this where they've got a coach and they say, should I include chess club and math club on the resume? Because even though my name doesn't sound Asian, they might put two and two together, and that will hurt my chances of getting. I mean, this is when you read in Malcolm Gladwell that 100 years ago they implemented essays, college essays, in order to weed out the Jewish kids, because on scores alone there were, quote, too many Jews getting into WASP schools, right? We all see that and we think, oh my God, where it's barbaric. It's so, but somehow the modern practice of keeping Asians out or keeping the numbers of Asians in many of these schools down goes down smooth with people. Look, ultimately, I think there is no end run around meritocracy that is really worth wanting. I think I supported the Supreme Court decision. I think even before that, it was clear from the precedent, which did action 96, that if you get rid of race-based affirmative action, you're not hanging out Black and Hispanic kids to dry. You are reshuffling the schools kids will get into, but often kids will be better matched with the schools they end up going to. In many ways, if you take a kid, a Black or Hispanic kid, because of affirmative action, he gets into a top 5 school instead of the top 20 school. He's now in the bottom 10th percentile of top 10 school, and that's done a lot of damage as well. What happens in those cases often is that kid goes into the top 5 school wanting to major in a hard science, but because they're in the bottom 10% of their class and the professors teach to the middle of the class, they feel they're drowning. When all things considered, they're a very smart, very capable student that could have gone to 20th or 30th ranked college, gotten a really good chemical engineering degree, gone on to have a great career, but now they switch to a soft science at MIT, right? And there's a lot of research to say that that's actually happened, unfortunately. So bottom line is there's no racial rigging, there's no cheating to get around meritocracy. There's no way you're going to help people by doing that in the long run. I think affirmative action on race has been a misguided experiment, though a very tempting one given the history of white supremacy. I understand why people were compelled by this idea, but I think it's a good thing we're moving away from it.
On the faculty side, one argument I hear is that we need affirmative action in faculty hiring to ensure that students from underrepresented backgrounds see faculty with similar background to them, faculty who look like them. Do you think there's merit to this argument?
You know, I think a while ago in American history, it was important for Black kids and Hispanic kids to see that you could achieve as a Black person and you could reach any, right? Because there is certain things just seem impossible until they don't, until you realize, oh, I could do that, right? I think that's a common experience many people have had. In 1950, I think that would have been very important, maybe even in 1950. Once we're at the point where we've had a successful 2-term Black president, where it's, I grew up it was commonplace to see Black doctors on to Omar Epps, right? Like that's Joe I watched when I was 10 years old. And it didn't even need to be commented upon that the smartest doctor in the show, other than main character Hugh Laurie, was Black. It didn't even need to be really commented on. It was just like, that's a thing. And you don't even think about it. So I think we're long past the point in American culture where we need to be efforting to send signals that as a Black person or a Hispanic person, you can achieve heights. I think we know that now. And, there is a lot of good research on this question. For instance, the famous experiments people do where you send out identical resumes with different names. One name sounds like a stereotypical white name. One name sounds like a stereotypical Black name, stereotypical Asian name, etc. They did a huge study at, I think it was NYU. And one of the questions they were looking at is, do minority professors treat minority students any better? And the answer was no. The answer was, it doesn't matter, right? So simply having professors that are Black, professors that are Hispanic doesn't guarantee any kind of real difference in terms of they're going to treat Black students better or anything like that. I think you've just got to get good professors. That's what matters. You have to have good professors, doctors. Every time you see one of these studies, and there are a dime a dozen, says, for instance, there was one like 2 years ago that found Black women giving birth had better health results with Black doctors. That white doctors are not able to recognize pain in Black people, which is an incredible claim. True. And then just a few weeks ago came out, the study was completely flawed, the data. Someone else looked at the data and it actually found no difference whatsoever, which accords a lot more, again, with my own experience and common sense. So my view is you need to get good people. You need to hire meritocratically, and let's treat the actual issue, which is intergenerational poverty, communities that have high crime, very few fathers, and attack that problem independent of the outcome. Attack that problem with all of our resources rather than trying to rig the result on the other end, pretend that we're making progress on what is really that real problem.
What about more voluntary race-conscious efforts on campus, like things like affinity groups? Too many people aren't required to participate in. Are those helpful?
I think so. I think they're okay for the following reason. And I was just talking to my dad about this recently, actually. So, no one has any problem with a Pakistani affiliation group on campus or a Jewish student group on campus. So in some sense, there's nothing wrong with Black students on campus either. But what you're talking about in that case is a culture rather than a race, right? Because African Americans are, we use this term Black, but that has two different dictionary entries. One is, anyone with African ancestry, as if I have something in common with someone from Ethiopia, which has had like distinct and separate culture for thousands of years. But then there's just African Americans as the particular ethnic group that formed in the context of slavery and developed basically a shared dialect, a shared culture, a shared set of music, a shared food, between the 17th century and today. Just like any other ethnic group, just like Jews, just like Pakistanis, like Irish, it's an ethnic group. And whatever you should be allowed to do with an ethnic group in terms of expressing solidarity, pride, I think you should be able to do as an African American. When it becomes toxic is when you confuse those two dictionary definitions. You forget that, yes, it's fine and can be good to celebrate with the culture, the subculture you come from, if that's what you're into. Also fine not to. What's not okay is to racially discriminate, right? To racially discriminate in the name of that, to ask your college for special treatment because of the color of your skin, to demand that other people get less than par treatment because of the color of their skin, to judge people, to use all the fashionable language that demeans people, that has become fashionable on elite college campuses and corners in the media. That is a very different thing.
Do you believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion should be considered core values?
I often wonder that because universities have a very schizophrenic attitude about it. On the one hand, there's no quicker way to get yourself kicked out of the dinner party than to question whether diversity is our strength. But at the same time, Columbia, where I went, and at dozens and dozens of colleges all across the country, as a Black student, you get there day one and they say, if you want, you can live in Black student housing and never see a white person. Do your very best to never see a white person for your 4 years here. You can go into the African American Studies department, which will be heavily overrepresented with Black people. And you can basically live as much as is plausible a segregated lifestyle. And we think that's fantastic, right? The idea of diversity is that you get better by meeting and mingling, getting to know people of other cultures. So to do that at the same time that the university validates separate dorms, separate graduations before it, tells me something that there's a schizophrenic attitude here towards what diversity is about. Ultimately, my view is that no one ever said Earth, Wind, and Fire is a great band, except they really needed a white guy. Or Beatles, love them. They needed a Spanish guy in there, right? So things can be great that are racially homogenous. Half my family went to historically Black colleges and universities like Howard and Spelman, and they had a very good time and cherished their time at those places, which are extremely undiverse. So my feeling is that diversity is like love. It is the best thing in the world when it's not forced. If you're forcing it, breaking all of your principles, cherished principles in order to get it, then you've kind of missed the point.
It's an ongoing political debate about DEI offices, especially in public universities. Do these units serve a valuable purpose in your mind? Should they be reformed? Should they be abolished? What do you think it's in?
I think we've run the experiment in full now, and we know that they don't work. Just next door at University of Michigan, the New York Times did a lengthy investigation a couple months ago. And what they found is that every problem the DEI bureaucracy is built to solve got worse as the university expanded DEI. Right? It's kind of like there's that old parable, or actually it's an old real story apparently. I think is when the British ruled India, they had a snake problem. So the British started paying people to bring in, right, thinking that would solve the problem. But what happened is people started breeding the snakes to get the paycheck. And then there ended up being far more snakes than at the beginning of the problem, right? So if you say, okay, as the president of Princeton did in the Trump era, our university is racist. Then Trump said, well, okay, I'm calling your bluff. Betsy DeVos, let's get in there. He's admitted to racism. Let's investigate. And then the Princeton president said, oh, no. I didn't mean to actually investigate, right? if you're going to say we have a huge problem with systemic racism, and so we're going to hire these people that are experts, and they're going to get to the root of it. They're DEI professors, they're DEI bureaucrats, and we're going to expand. We're going to go from one DEI task force to one DEI task force. We're going to do what Michigan did and have something like 250 diversity, equity, and inclusion staff, and their job is to find the racism. It's a little bit like hiring a ghost hunter, right? To come into your house. Do you think they're not going to find a ghost? Like, they're going to find it. Not only that, they're going to solicit it. They're going to contribute to a culture where what used to be a normal college conversation with your roommate that's from a different country, that's a little uncomfortable, but that is a growing experience. Now that becomes something you report to the DEI officer because it made you uncomfortable. You've been taught that when you're uncomfortable, that's racism, right? And so what happened at Michigan is, they used to have like 10 reports of racial incidents on campus a year, and it ballooned to like 200, 500 or something, right? And meanwhile, none of the actual metrics in terms of enrollment, grades, none of the actual measurable metrics for Black or Hispanic students improved. The only thing that happened is, people filed a report because someone asked you, where are you really from, right? Which is, so, and not to mention the waste of it all. So I think we've run the experiment and it's come back negative. DEI bureaucracies don't work. To the extent there are actual racial incidents on campus, right? There's crazy people out there. There's going to be a guy that's going to roll down his window and call somebody the N-word. I think universities can handle that without 250 DEI bureaucrats that nobody knows what they do. And if they didn't show up to campus tomorrow, no one would even notice, right? So I think that experiment has been run and it's come back negative.
So what do you think are the risks associated with adopting what you call a neo-racist, the sort of approach that Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo advance in pursuing racial justice?
Well, I think in America, we are running experiments in the big context of world history. We're running an experiment of multiracial democracy on equal terms. By that, I mean most countries in the world, historically and still today, conceive of themselves as an ethnicity. Japan is 99% Japanese, and they're keeping it that way. And the reason they do that is because things can go very, very wrong historically. The founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Tocqueville, one of their greatest fears was that when slavery does end, how are they ever going to forgive us? It's going to be a war. It's going to come to a war, and either white people or Black people are going to be extinguished, right? This was the fear. And this has happened in history. It's really happened over and over again, and genocide has happened. So, that may seem too grim, but what keeps us from inching towards a really terrible and racially tense reality is the principle, right? The colorblind principle, the fact that when Martin Luther King laid out that principle for the nation, it actually changed the hearts and minds of millions of people, right? It really did. And it did because it represents such a sound logic that I'm not going to treat you badly and you're not. It's a kind of truce, it just embodies a deep wisdom that any country seeking to retain racial harmony needs to live by.
So, what advice would you give to students or young thinkers who are hesitant to voice their opinions, especially on this topic, but on any topic in the current political and cultural climate?
I understand why you're hesitant, but it's important to align your speech with your values in life. Similar to the way that there's no end run around meritocracy that's going to get us where we want to go as a country, I don't think there's an end run around honesty that's going to get you in life. And while there is a wisdom to going along and getting along, like, I don't know, do you need to argue with your father-in-law at Thanksgiving? Probably not. In many situations in life, the way to get whatever you're trying to get with your friends, your relationships, is more honest, not less honest. And so I would say be a little braver than you tend to be. Run the experiment. It usually comes back a lot more interesting and rewarding than your fear would dictate. And always be a good listener as well. Don't just put forth your opinion. Really try to listen to the person. That's always an important aspect of sharing a controversial viewpoint.
So I have a lot more questions here, but I really want to give everybody else a chance to ask some. But we'll open it up to questions now. We have microphones on both sides, and we'll come and bring it to you.
Hi, Coleman. To what do you attribute the origins of your intellectual honesty? So I've followed some of your work on different podcasts, and you have sort of iconoclastic ideas. You're not swayed by the mob. You're not swayed by the masses. And I'm just wondering, where did that come from in your particular case?
Well, thank you, first of all. That's very nice of you to say. You know, everyone has a story about why they are the way they are. Often I feel those stories are just post hoc BS. For instance, whatever you think about race, people will often attribute it to your background. Okay? So quite probably the most common question I get is, well, Coleman, you're upper middle class. You grew up in a suburb with two parents. Don't you think that's the reason why you have these perspectives? If you had actually gone through more hardship growing up, don't you think you would think more like your critics do? And my response is, if you look at the most important Black conservative and the most important Black liberal thinker in the 20th century, who were they? James Baldwin, and Thomas Sowell. Okay, Baldwin, liberal, Sowell, conservative. They grew up in the same neighborhood at the same time, right? They both grew up in Harlem, 6 years apart. In fact, Sowell was poorer than Baldwin. And the lesson of that is that people can have very similar life experience, but interpret it totally different. I mean, if this is almost invariably true of family disagreements. I disagree with my sister about stuff, but we upbringing. So I think I could tell you a story about, and I kind of did tell you a story a little bit about how I come from and the college I went to. But the reality is, if I had had a totally different life, I might have come to conclusions via a different route.
Me? Hey, Coleman. Again, my name is Jack, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with you just before your talk, and that was pretty cool. And I've also enjoyed reading your book and hearing your podcasts. So my question for you then is, one of the interesting takeaways that I got from it was sort of how you lay out the problem of racism in America, especially as embodied by old school supremacists and neoliberals. And I think while you and I are largely in alignment on this, the question that sort of crossed my mind as I was reading it was, to what extent might it be the case that one similarity between you and, as you call them, the neo-racists, again, not to draw too many parallels between you and them, but to what extent might it be the case that you're both trying to fight white supremacy, but on fundamentally different terms? And then to what extent is it the case that neo-racism is the newest embodiment of racism, if not a direct successor from old school race supremacy, a separate yet almost as equally threatening threat? That makes sense.
The difference between me and neo-racist is that I am genuinely against racism in all its forms. I'm against old school white supremacy. And the only reason I don't talk about it more is because it's been so effectively defeated. The KKK used to count membership in the millions. Now it's in the single digit thousands, if that, right? There's been times recently where the Flat Earth Society has more members than the KKK. And you know, they make noise in the media. You see Richard Spencer in the media and so forth. But their actual power as a force in American politics has declined substantially. And even if you don't agree with me on that, white supremacy, I think, was it Sam Harris that put it this way? That it's a wolf in wolf's clothing, right? Nobody is confused about whether white supremacy is, you know, is it, oh, maybe it's kind of good, maybe they have a point, right? There's very little of that needs to be done in the public discourse right now. But what I call neo-racism is very popular in elite institutions. A lot of people that mistake it for they mistake it for virtue. They mistake it for the correct approach to race issues. They mistake it for anti-racism, when in fact, it's really the newest flavor of racism, right? When you have a woman, I think by the name of Kililani, I quote her in my book, at Yale giving a talk, publicly saying that she fantasizes about shooting white people in the head with no guilt, walking away with no guilt, feeling like she's done the world with her words. I don't know what to call that if not racism, right? You know, if that's not racism, then it simply isn't possible to be racist against white people. And that's actually part of the philosophy, is that racism equals prejudice plus power. Therefore, how convenient. People like me can't be racist, right? I mean, this is extraordinarily convenient if you happen to be born in the group that can do the bad thing. No matter how many bad things you do, it's fine out of existence, right? It's far too convenient for my liking. The philosophy of the civil rights movement absolutely rejected that definition. Martin Luther King took it for granted that it was possible to be a black racist to white people. It's just that white racism was a much bigger problem at the time, right? It's not that he didn't think it was possible. It just was, you know, you were getting lynched, right? So it's a fundamentally different philosophy. Neo-racism paints itself as anti-racist, but it just is a new kind of socially acceptable bigotry that's backed by the kind of facade of expertise that comes with PhDs and so-called experts writing about how they have studies that says actually they've proved that black people can't be racist, as if that's a proposition that can be proved, right? So that would be the difference, me and neo-racist.
Thank you. I think it's fair to say, Coleman, that many of the critiques that you get are straw men get a lot of sort of characterize your work. Curious if there any sort of eel men argument that you really thought that you thought, okay, that's a good point. Incorporate this. Curious, as you've been writing about this for several years, there have been sort of dialogue that you at a minimum thought like, okay, that's it. I hadn't thought of it that way. Modified or how you sort of taken on critiques, most of which would say are unfair. Across this thought,
it's happened a lot of times. It's just I can't think of them only because if they're strong enough points, they become incorporated in my worldview. So then I own those opinions and their opinions because they persuaded me in the past, like good critique plus time equals my new opinion. So there you go. Good question. Yeah, I think, well, this wasn't a public critique, but it was from Glenn Lowry. And his point was that, my book, I really focus on colorblind public policy, how no public policy should racially discriminate. But isn't the deeper question whether we should care about quality of outcome at all? Right? It's like, that's what Glenn said to me, is that may be a deeper question. And then once we settle that question, then we can talk about what means we should and shouldn't use in order to help close racial gaps. Okay? Because you could help close racial gaps using colorblind public policies in principle, right? I gave the Roland Fryer example before. So that I didn't deal enough with that more fundamental question is a critique that Glenn sent me that I thought was very interesting.
Thanks. So this may follow up a little bit with the discussion of equality of outcome versus quality of opportunity. As I'm sure you're aware, America is an unequal place. So is the world. And it seems like you're, totally in favor of policies that might work, or open to policies that might eliminate or reduce differences in equality opportunity, opposed to look at equality of outcome. And I guess I'm just wondering in particular, I know you talk about it very, very briefly in the book, but about a reparation. I want to just give you a chance to talk about that. Again, assuming one can happen it to, the called ADOS and whether or not there's, sort of something in, sin of America, big sin of them, that, makes there might be some way in which the outcomes are in fact product lack of.
So there's a couple different questions there, Roland. One is reparations. Is it a good idea? Does reparations help us mitigate equality of opportunity? I don't think so. I mean, it's if you're talking about cash reparations for slavery, for instance, it's not a policy any economist think of to address poverty because automatically it's irrespective of social class, right? Like I'm a descendant of American slaves and I would get the check that I definitely don't need. If we're talking about, like, we can't be giving checks to people in the top decile, the top two deciles, and imagine that you're addressing quality of opportunity problem when that same money could be much better spent in poverty. So the reparations policy is it's a symbolic one, right? It's the idea that it's going to heal the nation. That's really the man of what a reparations check might do, that it would close some chapter, it would provide psychological closure to a nation traumatized by its initial hypocrisy as freest country on earth, founding fathers preaching liberty while at the same time holding slaves. Even worse than that, the founding fathers revolting against Britain, saying that Britain is treating the 13 colonies like a slave master without always realizing many of them were actual slave masters. I don't believe that reparations is going to solve that. I really don't. I think if we did, what's today, Wednesday? We did reparations today, I would be reading op-eds in the New York Times tomorrow by all the usual suspects saying, how dare you think that was enough? You really think we've reached closure on the slavery issue with a simple check of insert whatever the amount was? Absolutely not. I think there's a psychological dynamic going on with reparations advocates, which is usually when someone asks for an apology, they actually want it. But sometimes people prefer the ability to keep ending it. Right? Like the having the grievance is worth more to them alive than foreclosed on. Makes sense. And that's what's going on with reparations advocates, is the ability to claiming the initial grievance. That's their power. That's their power. If reparations actually ever happened, their power would be gone. Why would they ever allow that? And besides, they have a point. How can you ever make up for slavery with a check? It's kind of a ridiculous notion, especially considering that no one is alive who was themselves a slave, right? I mean, I can understand Holocaust survivors. They felt very conflicted about that check too, and many rejected it completely. But at least the people, at least the aggrieved parties were themselves alive to provide for them. Now everyone who's alive is basically a grifter, right? Like it's what incentive do they have to accept that closure? It would make no sense from their own perspective, you know. So I don't think it's a good policy for the closure of the nation. And finally, I think what's more important is to realize that absolutely slavery was horrible. The hypocrisy of it made it some way worse. But slavery was a worldwide institution on every single inhabited continent. Many places abolished slavery long after we did. Many societies on earth had as many slaves as. And what's unique about America is not the fact that slavery existed. Slavery existed in Africa for almost 100 years after it ended, Korea for 50 years after, China and Russia. What's unique is that America was the first country founded with a written constitution that stressed liberty and individual rights. That's what made America hypocritical. The whole world had slavery, and then one little part of the world started inching what we now think of as modernity, with one foot in the past, one foot in the present. There was bound to be an awkward transition where it's hypocrisy. From one lens, you can call it hypocrisy. From another lens, you can call it the process of progress, right? Like progress in history doesn't just move stepwise. Like we go from the ancient world where there's never been a text condemning slavery, full stop. The Bible, not the Quran, not the Buddhist Analects. That's the old world. 10,000 years, and then snap, world with no slavery and liberty. It wasn't going to happen like that. There was going to be a gray area in between. That gray area is the time in which America was founded. I don't hold that against America. I think that's a very bizarre perspective.
So I think one big barrier to this sort of vision campus you envision, there seems to be a profound rhetorical imbalance and our activism unfolds on campus. So where it's handled, someone could come in here, student protesters, start cysts and things like that, and at least with the carries a weight. And as you noted, there are DI stormtroopers on campus who can force those claims. Whereas if I respond by saying you're against free speech or debate, it does not remotely the same. There's not even like a to refer to those people, whereas they can call someone racist, or something. Is there any way around that problem? Because as far as I can see, a lot of the stuff here offhandedly refer to someone of hung the knife, despite it. It's always going to carry more weight, saying they're against.
First thing to note is that's actually a testament to how much we care about racism in this country. Most places in the world are not. Most of human history has not been like that. The reason it works is because since the civil rights movement, Americans of all backgrounds actually worry privately that they might have an internal conscious, internal sense of caring about the issue. That's a sign of our progress. That's not a sign of our, a sign of our moral corruption. That people are even vulnerable to that kind of smear speaks to how far we have come. So there's that to consider. But I think it has to be kept in proportion because guilt is not useful emotion, only useful to a certain extent. Yes, you should question yourself, question your own motives, question your sure, but also don't gaslight yourself. If you know that you are not the racism problem that we need to be talking about, don't let yourself be bullied on that account. And I don't think it's hopeless because these dynamics have a way of correcting, which is to say, if, it can't go on forever. That's what I'm saying, right? Just the parable of the boy who cried wolf. That's a real phenomenon in language. The more a word gets used, the less power it has, the more it gets misused. So, for instance, racism has already often been replaced by white supremacy, which is adding turbo to the engine a little bit because racism has been deflated of some of its significance. And eventually that term is also going to lose a lot of its bite if people continue to overuse it, which is also a bad thing when the real racist comes in the door. And so, I think that strategy on the part of the rhetorically stronger, it's a short-sighted strategy, and it might seem like it has the high ground right now, but that can't last forever.
We have one more question. We have time for one more.
Thanks. Yeah, I think early in your talk, you identified correctly, I think, the problem that exists of income disparities among numerous ethnic and how great they are. I think part of the problem, I'm wondering if you would agree, is that in this country, there's a great move towards talking about class differences. I mean, we're supposed to pretend that American society is totally classless and that differences between class simply don't exist. And as a result, we've shunted off questions of those differences into others, such as racial distinctions. So I guess what I'm asking is, to what extent do you think it's a problem that the discussion of whether or not class distinctions matter in America is a taboo that's not really supposed to be discussed openly? And would it be better if we were to acknowledge more frankly the existence of class differences as a problem as far as economic opportunity is concerned? Thanks.
Good question. I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, I think inequality is an important issue, and it should be part of the conversation because we should use public policy to mitigate it in some ways. You know, the earned income tax credit is a pretty widely lauded policy that helps people on the lower end of the income spectrum. To the extent that talking about class differences helps get more of those policies, that's a good thing. On the other hand, the language of class differences has gone pretty poorly in a lot of places in the world, from China to Russia to Venezuela to Cuba and so forth. And so the fact that we haven't had class warfare in America, which is kind of the flip side of the taboo that you're talking about, because we don't talk about it, we don't have mass political movements about it. Even Occupy Wall Street is really a footnote in history books, right? Part of the result of that has been the strongest economy in the history of the world that every poor migrant around the world wants to knocking on the door to get into. So I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's partly because of our aversion to politics of class, to what you might call socialist politics, that our economy and our growth has remained robust enough to be attractive to, you know, to the basically the poor of the world. If it's not all of our parents, then it was our grandparents or our great grandparents, depending on how far back you go. But they all came here because, you know, this was the place where you can be the immigrant with nothing and goes to Harvard. Been happening for a long time. It still happens today. So that'd be my answer to that.
All right, Coleman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Hope you get to try some cheap fruits while you're there.